you have to pay the state the royalty for that barrel of oil, which by convention in Saudi Arabia is set at 20% of the selling price. So that would be $12 a barrel, with much more than the actual cost of producing it. Now, the other costs are quite important as well. The half cycle cost is the cost of maintaining a field, not running it down, but continuing to invest in new drillings, new infrastructure around the field to keep it running. And there you can see the costs go up enormously. And then there's a full cycle cost, which is the, if you started from square one and you had to open up a new field, make an investment decision about it, and that's $75 a barrel. That's probably now about $50 a barrel, somewhere around about there in the US. In other words, it makes a big difference. There's a big margin now between what it cost you to open up a new field, as distinct from the cost of just continuing production in existing fields. Okay. There are other break-even points. One that's cited quite a lot is what's known as the fiscal break-even, particularly important in Saudi Arabia, because the Aramco doesn't only pay the state royalties, it also pays it massive proportion of its revenue. And the state uses that revenue as a huge part of its own income. And so this is known as the fiscal break-even, which is the price of oil which would be needed for the state to balance its books rather than the company to balance its books. And this idea, by the way, it's not very elaborate in literature, but it's actually particularly useful idea in terms of looking at corporations. Okay. And then finally, the true cost of oil doesn't even come anywhere near any of this, right? Because they're almost entire externalities, so-called, the environmental impacts or the cost of avoiding the environmental impacts are just not borne by the industry, hardly at all. So if you like, on a more rational, self-reproducing ecological basis, then these costs would go up much higher. Next, please. Okay, are they friends or are they enemies? Saudi Arabia has become, or had become, what's known as a stabilizing or residual producer. In other words, if you remember that cost curve that I spoke so much about and spent so much time on, right? The way that Saudi Arabia can act is in two dimensions, right? It can decide that it wants to keep the price of oil at $60, right? In which case, if demand increases, tending to put the price up, then it has to reduce its production, okay? On the other hand, if the price of oil looks like it's going up and Saudi Arabia wants to keep the price down, it has to expand its production. So it kind of assumes that the low-cost producer is capable of almost at will reducing or expanding production. And for a long time, the Saudi Arabian, the nature of their industry meant that they had a huge spare capacity and they could do that. But quite a lot of the specialists in the industry think that actually their capacity to do that was beginning to run out because of the huge increase in demand for oil from China and India in the beginning of the 21st century meant that Saudi production was reaching its limit as well. So it couldn't really play this role of, turning on and off the taps at will in order to control the price. Okay. Big question is, why would you do it if you were Saudi Arabia? And the answer is, well, it's not just Saudi Arabia, really, is it? Right? Aramco, Arabian American company, okay, was started in 1933. Now, Saudi Arabia is a bit like Panama. It's a state built around an interest of imperialism. The Panama Canal came before Panama the state. Aramco came before Saudi Arabia, right? In that sense, right? So the whole setup of the Saudi state is a sort of a neo-colonial one. It's a deal between the US and the very corrupt elite in Saudi Arabia, okay? So what Saudi Arabia gets for keeping the price of oil at a level which the US also agrees with is that it gets huge state revenue if it keeps the price high, but it spends an awful lot of that revenue buying arms from the US and the UK, by the way. Okay, so what we have is a classic neo-colonial type of relationship where you have a highly repressive regime, nominally independent, but as President Trump, one of the few things he said, which is true, said recently, they wouldn't last 2 weeks without our support. Okay, and our support, you look at the top left, massive armament sales. Saudi Arabia is the biggest importer of arms in the world. It's just an incredible per head expenditure on arms, which they use to bomb Yemen. They're becoming have for some time in one sense, it's sort of a complex relationship. They have this relationship with the US on the one hand, but they also act as a sub-imperial power on the other hand, policing the whole area more and more. Okay, now with the tensions which have been happening with this recent round, with the US beginning to compete on oil with Saudi Arabia, shows signs of the relationship breaking down. It's certainly not the case that Saudi Arabia is a direct client of the US, but at the same time, it has to take really seriously what Washington wants. Otherwise, they ain't going to get the arms. Okay, next. Okay, this is the penultimately oil profits in the COVID crisis. So are they stranded assets? Next. All right, another slightly technical and bit complicated diagram. This one is quite counterintuitive, so I will briefly explain it. Okay, it's there, but it's kind of like lost. It was very tiny. EBITDA, right? EBI, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, is basically an indicator of corporate profit. Okay, so